Computer. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reimagining Migrations. Actually, first webinar, first kickoff for the year. We are talking about the Chicano Movement in Boyle Heights, teaching student activism in honor of Hispanic Heritage Month. I know we're coming near the end of the month, but it's better now than never to honor the rich history that Latinos, Hispanics, Chicanos, Mexican Americans, we'll talk about identity in a second, they have to this country. My name is Habir Ramadan Shinawi. I am Program Director for Reimagining Migration. We are a nonprofit. Our organization is located out of Boston, but we actually work all over the country. What I say telecommute, because I'm originally from Chicago, but I live in Maryland, so I travel all over for us to do the work. We hope you enjoy our session today. Just a couple of things, please keep your mic muted until you want to make a comment. I will be monitoring the chat while Ms. Macias is conducting the the slide deck. I'm showing my age, PowerPoint. People don't use PowerPoint anymore, right? And also I will be giving out links to resources and a survey at the end. So if you could sit tight just when we're done, I can definitely be providing that to you, and we will be sending a follow-up email as well. Oh, closed captioning, you know, that's a good question. The closed captioning may be in the little chat piece for everyone. If not, I can definitely check our sources and see if I can bring up the closed captioning for you as well. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Elisabeth.
Okay, so I'm really happy to be here. Thank you all for being here tonight. I know it's Thursday evening and we're going into the weekend. My name is Elisabeth Macias. I was a history teacher at a traditional public school and then at a private school in DC, where I taught a variety of things, U.S. history, for the last 4 years. And I'm currently a master's student at GW at the American Studies Department, where I focus on, in particular, immigration, race, and education. And I'm really happy to be here to speak with you and about teaching kind of one slice of the Chicano movement, in particular focused on Boyle Heights. And so I wanted to start off by taking a look. I hope you can see this mural that is in Boyle Heights on the side of a building. And I'd love to hear from someone, either chat or if you want to unmute yourself. What do you notice here? What does this say to you? What do you think about this when you see it? What strikes you?
So we have in the chat. Power and unity. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely.
What else? The older man and the younger child, generational, wondering about the symbols of some of the images, right? The UFW flag. Yeah, Elisabeth and I were actually just talking a little bit about that before we got on.
Yeah, and that's particularly relevant to what we're talking about. Yeah, absolutely. And so this is from it's in Boyle Heights. There is actually an interesting web page of students at, I think, the University of Southern California created kind of a digital project where they took photos of different murals in Boyle Heights to show the ways that people were laying claim to space across time, especially in the 1960s and 1970s. And this is just one Chicano power comes across as well, but there's a lot more in there as well. So it's an interesting resource, and it highlights some of the public art within Boyle Heights. So I grew up in Northern California and went to public schools in Northern California at schools where there were mostly Latinx students. And we never learned about the Chicano movement. We didn't really learn much about Mexican American history or Latinx history at all. And I really want that to change. And so that's part of what I want to do here today. we're going to be looking at the actions of young Chicanos in East LA in the 1960s to really improve their educational opportunities, to make their schools, work for them, and to make curricular changes, but also changes in terms of teaching as well. We'll look to the Raza newspaper, an excerpt from that, to help us kind of understand how that was a place where students and young people were kind of creating identity and documenting the actions of their community, which were often excluded from mainstream news. The LA Times often kind of sided with the establishment at the time as well. So while there aren't like exact parallels between what these young people were calling for and what many students today are calling for, especially students of color, is that we can see some kind of similar demands in the types of things they wanted for their education. So first, these are some essential questions that, for me, it's an iterative process, kind of thinking about a topic, looking at sources, coming up with essential questions, and then tweaking what we're going to do. But these are a couple that are kind of guiding me through this. How can one's identity influence taking action to build inclusive and equitable communities? And how might we use our voice and spheres of influence to create and sustain inclusive and welcoming communities? So thinking about identity as central to creating equitable communities, and then also that kind of civic action piece. What are things that we can take, and we being teachers, students, administrators more broadly as well. So connecting to reimagining migration, this is the fifth disposition. So reimagining migration has outlined different dispositions related to their learning arc that are kind of important for people to understand, I think, in a world on the move. And so I think these are the ones that are particularly relevant today, and take action to foster inclusive and sustainable societies, recognize circles of responsibility and influence, issues of taking up voice and action, and reflecting and revising action. So I see those as connected to kind of the content we're talking about today, but also the process of kind of learning about that, at least for me. So this is where we're focusing on. Boyle Heights in Los Angeles. It's on the east side of Los Angeles. And a lot of the impetus for this came for me from this book, Boyle Heights, which I found really interesting. Boyle Heights, How Los Angeles Neighborhood Became the Future of American Democracy. And so I'll be referring to materials from that as well. And a snapshot of Boyle Heights in the 1950s and 1960s. In 1968, Mexican-American students in the East LA public schools in Boyle Heights had very high dropout rates, so about 57% at one particular. The physical plants of these schools were dilapidated, so they weren't getting kind of the resources that other schools were, or that were needed. There wasn't the commitment to keeping them up. And this was a relatively young Mexican-American community at the time. Not to say there weren't Mexican-Americans, and then before that Mexicans, and before that Spaniards in this area for a long time, just that this specific population skewed young. And a lot of the population, about half, was under 20 years old. So a lot of young people. These schools are affecting a lot of different people. And many of the Spanish-speaking students in particular felt that they were tracked and were tracked into the away from kind of the college-bound tracks in school. So tracking is something that they were focused on and wanted to change. So that's a snapshot. I want to go back a little bit, though, and talk about some of the earlier history of Boyle Heights and this particular neighborhood. So for a long time, Boyle Heights has had kind of a storied history as a multiracial neighborhood, one where there, especially in the 20th century, a long history of Russian immigrants, Jewish immigrants, African Americans in the community for a long time, and that the population grows, in particular in the 1950s, Armenians, Italians, and some Anglos as well. And so this is an image of the Breed Street Shoal. There were about 30 synagogues in Boyle Heights. I think this is the only remaining one, and there are efforts, like community efforts, to maintain it and to ensure that it continues to exist. And Boyle Heights had one of the biggest Jewish populations west of Chicago in the early 20th century as well. So this has shaped the history of Boyle Heights. and had a history of a long Japanese population, between 5,000 and 6,000 or so people of Japanese descent living in this neighborhood, and that certainly shaped the history of it as well. This is an education class that kind of highlights this. And as I mentioned before, a long history of African Americans in this neighborhood, been growing in numbers, especially with the movements from the deep south to the north and to the west, and the Great Migration. And this is a picture of two young children outside their home in Boyle Heights in 1943. So during the war itself. And so I'll come back to this in a second. So this is a multiracial neighborhood. Some people call it the Ellis Island of the West, because sometimes people would come, kind of, get their bearings and maybe move on if they could. But it's very much shaped by racial exclusion. So what can help to explain why such a diverse cast of people lived here is partly goes back to racially restricted covenants. So this was the form of one form of housing discrimination used widely in California. I remember my mom's home in Northern California had a racially restricted covenant in it, and it's from 1942. And what this did, it would include in deeds who could not purchase that property. And so people exclude racialized minorities, could exclude people based on religion in particular. And it was something that contributes to why there were so many people of color living in this particular Boyle neighborhood and not in the west of the city. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, Los Angeles was marketed by kind of boosters and those trying to get people from the Midwest to move as kind of this Aryan city in the sun. And that is, we see that shaping the housing policy. This is also a neighborhood, because of the great diversity, that's really hit hard by things like Japanese incarceration, the expulsions of Mexicans and Mexican Americans during the Great Depression as well. And that brings me to this letter, which highlights something else, some of the kind of cross-racial coordination or friendships or communication. This is a letter from Molly Wilson Murphy. She was in high school at the time when she wrote this. She graduated in 1943. She lived in, she was an African-American at this time, like young woman who lived in Boyle Heights, and she had many friends who were Japanese or Japanese-American. And so she maintained a correspondence with them when they were away, when they were incarcerated during World War II. And so this particular letter is from her friend, Tomoko, and it's a little bit hard to see. Can anyone read any of that? I want to be able to decipher some of that. My curse, it took me a while.
I don't mind reading it.
Okay.
I know cursive for some people, like my children don't know cursive. It's like a foreign language to them. So this is June 10th, 1942. Dear Molly, thank you very much for your note. I am all right now, but so far I've been ill for 4 days here. It's still from the food, but the food is getting better. Don't work too hard, and 2 is underlined, to end the semester. I really feel like a dope for not going to school. I miss it, believe it or not. Glad to hear, quote, Cotton Day was a success. See ya very soon, I think.
I think it's a
see ya,
sayonara.
Mara is written. Is that what it says? Don't forget it now. Please write again, very sincerely. And that is from Tomoko. Is that a J or a SH? Shide?
I think it's Ikeda.
Ikeda. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, it's hard to see.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
You're
absolutely. So, I mean, I just thought this was she kept a correspondence with her friend. There are about 112 letters, so it's ongoing, and she hears from them at different points in time in this process. So this is at a relocation center. She hears about them later from these different camps, and I think Molly Wilson Murphy was kind of like a famous individual in this community because she lived there for a very long time. But this highlights kind of some of the connections in this community, in this kind of multiracial community. Not that it was always perfect and there was, great relations between folks all the time, but this is kind of one example of that kind of cross-cultural interaction, which is shaped this. There's demographic change as well in the 20th century. So after 1948, when the Supreme Court essentially makes the racially restrictive covenants not viable anymore, and with the kind of post-war World II changes to the economy and housing, people who have the kind of the wherewithal, the money mostly, started to move out of the neighborhood and started to change. And by the 1960s and 1970s in particular, it was a largely Mexican-American and Central American neighborhood. And a lot of those folks were people who were immigrants. So not as much the kind of Mexicans or Mexican-Americans who'd been in the country for a long time. So that starts to change in the 60s and the 70s in particular. This is something that I hope you can see when I click on it. I will, Abir is going to share with you later. So instead of like talking about that, this is something you might want to share with your students. If I were teaching high school right now, I probably would use this. These are some excerpts from Boyle Heights, this book here, with some questions to help them process this that get at this kind of history of Boyle Heights, which I think is important for kind of understanding what these young people in 1968 that we're going to talk about later do in the Chicano movement. So we'll share this with you later in case it's of use to you in any way. So I want to talk about language a little bit as we're kind of moving from that kind of past history of Boyle Heights to looking at the 1960s when it's largely a community where the population is Mexican-American. And we're here, this is a Hispanic Heritage Month webinar. And so Hispanic in particular, and these are contested terms, right? People have different ways to interpret them. People have different preferences. I'm Mexican-American, I prefer Latina or Latinx, so I'm talking about populations, but there are different reasons for people to have preferences for this. Hispanic, I see is largely emphasizing Spanish heritage. And that is first used in the census in 1980. So that kind of comes to be recognized officially in the census at that time, in large part due to the work of Hispanic people to try to make sure that their population is counted and recognized. And then Latino, a term that had been used before, but can be more expansive and can be interpreted to include more folks in the Americas. Of Latin American descent. So that could include not only people who live in places that were colonized by Spain or Spain. So that could include Haiti, for example, or some English-speaking colonies there as well. Again, contested. And this is on the census along with Hispanic for the first time in 2000. And interestingly, and you may have read some of the think pieces about this, Latinx has been used increasingly to, because Latino is a gendered term and Latinx can be used to include gender nonconforming folks or people who are non-binary as well. This image, accept me for what I am, Chicano, is what we're going to talk about next. And just like the others, I mean, this is kind of what my take on, based on what we're talking about today, about kind of talking about what Chicano is. And I see this as an anti-assimilationist stance, kind of a shift away from what folks might call the Mexican-American generation, who, not all, and we're talking broadly, whose legal efforts for inclusion were to be often focused on being treated as white Americans. And so this is a different stance. It's also reclaiming a slur. So Chicano did, and to some people probably still means, kind of supposed to imply that someone's like low class, someone is not cultured. There's also, for a lot of Chicano in this moment in particular, an emphasis on indigenous ancestry and mestizaje, right? The mixing of the different groups that were in Mexico, either by choice or because by force. So people of African descent who were enslaved, indigenous and Spanish as well. This is also signaling political consciousness, and that's going to come across, I think, in the sources that we look at today, and so much more, because there are, different versions of Chicano-ness, probably as many as there are Chicanos. This quote, I thought, captured some of the essence of it for me. A Chicano is a Mexican-American with a non-Anglo image of himself. So it's about that self-identification. And Ruben Salazar was the first Mexican-American writer for the LA Times, newspaper writer for the LA Times. And he was tragically killed when he was covering the moratorium, the Chicano moratorium, so the protests against the Vietnam War, hit by a canister fired by the LA County Sheriff. But he was one of the few in kind of big mainstream outlets that were covering the Chicano community as well. And to make sure that I don't become too myopic, I want to highlight that the Chicano movement is broad. It has different thrusts in different places. It's not unique to Boyle Heights here, though there are kind of different focus points in different areas. But this is just a map that shows Chicano student organizations, 1967 to present, and then Chicano newspapers in the 60s and 70s. So it shows us that this is a pretty geographically broad movement as well. And there's some coordination between these different locations. So in order to kind of get a sense of what we're talking about, the Chicano movement, I wanted to look at an excerpt from the La Raza newspaper. And this was a newspaper in print from 1967 to 1977. And it was established by people who had worked at the United Farm Workers, so people who had written for that newspaper, the United Farm Workers, and it started in a church basement in East LA with a number of goals, but I thought this captured it well, documented the violence that was taking place, bearing witness, and it was much more than this as well. So I wanted to take a look at this because they were reporting on issues of concern in that community, in the Mexican American and Chicano community. La Raza means the people, so referring to what a early 20th century Mexican philosopher talked about as the cosmic race, so this kind of mestizo group, and so it's the people in particular is kind of the common translation. What I would like to do is to take a minute or take 5 minutes really, to use this thinking routine to help us look at one of these sources. This is something that we'll send you after in case it's of use to you. It has some information about the Raza newspaper, has some information about school walkouts in 1968 in LA that we're going to talk about a little bit later. And it has excerpts to the La Raza newspaper with links that can help you or students get to them. So in case you want this for your own interest, or if you want to use this to share with students. There's so much more. It's also very fun to just kind of scroll through the actual newspapers themselves. So what I'm going to ask is that this is one of the Project Zero thinking routines, and it's helpful for taking different perspectives, so perspective taking. And I'll ask that you go to this link and maybe I'll put it in here.
I added it also in the
Oh, okay.
just want to make sure everybody has access to it. So if somebody can click on the link, make sure that it's applicable. Okay. There you go. That's
awesome. Thank you very much. So as you're looking at this, so there are images, there's text, there's a political cartoon, identify a person or agent that you're examining, that you're going to kind of focus on. It could be someone in the photo, it could be the author of the text. And step in, given what you know at the time, what do you think this person might believe or experience? We're trying to understand the perspective. Stepping out after, what else would you like to know? So what do you need to understand to better know what's going on? And then step back. This is kind of like the metacognitive self-reflection piece we might have our students do also. Given your exploration of this perspective, what do you notice about your own perspective and what it takes to take somebody else's? So I'll ask that you take a look. I'm going to leave this here so people can see it. If you want to take 5 minutes to take a look at this source, and we'll come back together, and I'd love to hear from some folks. So we'll be monitoring the chat. If you have any questions or tech problems, let's come back together in 5 minutes.
About 2.5 minutes left. About 30 seconds. Wrap up your thoughts. All right.
All right, great. Thanks for timing us. I'd love to hear from a few people. You could either talk about, one of these prompts, or you could walk us through the whole thing. It'd be good to hear from, one or two. You could chat it, you could write it in the chat, or unmute yourself and go ahead and tell us maybe who you were focused on.
Is there anything in particular from what you saw from the resources that really made you go, aha, or caught your eye, or made a connection to maybe to what's going on today?
I can share.
Thank you, Megan.
Yeah. I was going to put in the chat, but this is going to take forever. So, I mean, my eye was caught by the middle picture on the right column, where all just this crowd of seemingly happy people, which was like a contrast to the headings and everything else that you were seeing. So that's why it drew my eyes. So I kind of focused on the student who was holding the sign. I think it says Educación and Justicia. And so I noticed in that group, people are smiling. And I mean, to me, it seems like there's sort of this elation and taking action as part of a group. And, holding a sign that has Spanish language and not English. It's sort of you're part of a movement, you're part of your identity, and you're taking a stand. And in that moment, you are you might be upset, but you also feel that sort of elation or community with other people. So that's where I was going.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And it is interesting how much it contrasts with some of the other images here, but it highlights that aspect of what we're going to see a little bit more about in this documentary clip, these walkouts in 1968 in East LA. Thank you for that. And a lot of the folks who wrote for La Raza were participating in either at these or helping to organize them. There were college students who wrote for La Raza. And so this was also a place for organizing. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to look at this in particular, because of the connections between not only the coverage of the walkouts, which is great to have, but because it is people are involved in these actual walkouts themselves. And the Spanish language really stands out to me as well, because that's something that students were calling for, is culturally responsive education, bilingual education. Absolutely. So to that, and maybe you were left with a few questions about wanting to know more context. I wanted to watch a short clip. This is something Abir shared with me, and I thought it was helpful. It includes lots of information, and it's also not terribly long. And we can kind of see what gaps this might fill in for us. And you might think about what images, like Megan did, stand out to you. What do you think about what you saw and heard? What are you left wondering after this as well? And then what does this help us understand about the La Raza excerpt we analyzed? So providing some context there as well. So I'd love to watch this.
Yeah, I'll share my screen, but just to give you context, this is all from Project Zero's thinking routines, which I will add the link. But it's also in the chat, the See, Think, Wonder, what images, like we said, stand out? What do you think about what you saw and heard? What are you left wondering? And what does this help us understand about La Raza excerpt we analyze as well, so making that connection. And the thinking routines and everything that you do today, hopefully you can take back and utilize in your classroom or with your professional development, or if you're not in this classroom, whatever area of profession that you have as well. So I'm going to share my screen so we can do the video. And share. Here we go. Larger. All right. Somebody can just go on screen, or Elisabeth, you can give me a thumbs up for the
Manila's
sound.
high school walkouts of 1968 were a pivotal moment in the Chicano.
Can't hear it anymore.
And the segregated and poorly maintained Mexican-American schools that they had been forced into in an attempt to illustrate the resentment of the blatant shortcomings in their educational system. Mexican-American schools at this time were segregated facilities furnished with low-quality learning equipment, inexperienced teachers, and most unjustly, a curriculum that focused on teaching of industrial and domestic skills. This type of backwards education almost guaranteed the Mexican-American niche in labor positions, preventing Mexican-American social mobility. The student walkouts of 1968 were a physical manifestation of the frustration felt by young Mexican students in America, and helped to reveal the beginnings of the social struggle for equality and recognition of Chicanos by a new generation of youth. This student movement, however, drew influence from prior events that dramatically impacted the effort for civil equality of minorities. These events included the Watts riots and the Great Boycott of 1965. Interview with Moctezuma Esparza, a key figure in the student walkouts, highlights the origins of the walkouts and provides an explanation for the frustrations of the Mexican-American youth. Esparza notes that there was a very small group of people who organized the walkouts and created the Chicano civil rights movement, but they ignited a firestorm that was ready because that anger was below the surface of thousands and thousands of students. In other words, the walkouts began with the ideas of a minority group of students with a background that granted them the ability to organize the movement. But the movement drew its power from the rallying cry of the thousands of other students and youths that felt this way, but were uncertain of how to express their frustration. When asked about the most prominent injustices he faced going to school in the late 60s as a young Chicano, Esparza recalled, there was the obvious social injustice of living in the country as Chicanos and Mexicanos, all being programmed to become laborers. None of us were being programmed to enter college. There was a realization that the dropout rate was not our own failure, but that of the system, which pre-programmed us. The failure on our part was we bought into it, and we accepted that was all we could do. Chicano youths felt that their tailored education system was confining them to a life as laborers, a position that many generations of Chicanos before them had filled. These youths realized that their chances for social mobility were minimal, considering they were withheld a proper education that would avail them social advancement in higher education. So, rather than stay in school, they dropped out and accepted the jobs for which they had been programmed. However, with the surge of anger at their dismal academic conditions came the realization that their failure was not the problem, but rather the system that was setting them up for failure. Chicano students no longer allowed the status quo of the population to claim that they were doing the best they could for a population that really didn't have what it took to succeed, but forced them to look at the blatant faults within their own educational system. These faults are highlighted in the list of demands proposed by the students to the East Los Angeles School Board.
These demands were to be presented to the Los Angeles Board of Education with the expectation that school officials would immediately respond and agree to their petition. The demands were a representation of the injustices and mistreatment that the students tolerated within their high schools. The proposed demands revealed the lack of resources and attention provided to Chicanos by the school officials. A general trend of the demands was the need to be culturally recognized as Mexican American and the necessity to eliminate discrimination by school officials. One of the demands included a direct request for bilingual education. Bilingual bicultural education will be compulsory for Mexican Americans in the Los Angeles City school system, where there is a majority of Mexican American students. This demand demonstrated the students' desires to have a learning environment that was culturally and linguistically relevant to their lives. Among other demands, students asked for the inclusion of a curricula that would relate to their cultural experiences, stating, "Textbooks and curriculum will be developed to show Mexican and Mexican American contribution to the U.S. society and to show the injustices that Mexicans have suffered as a culture of that society. Textbooks should concentrate on Mexican folklore rather than English folklore, as well as student body offices shall be open to all students. A high grade point average shall not be considered as a prerequisite to eligibility." These demands exhibit the diminished cultural recognition of Chicanos at the time and reveal that blatant discrimination they experience daily.
Ultimately, the East Los Angeles high school walkouts of 1968 were a bold response to the societal oppression that Mexican Americans faced throughout their daily lives. In the wake of these student protests emerged a critical conscious Chicano community that continues to strive for equality in our present society.
Okay. It's all yours, Elisabeth.
Right. Can you unshare?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
It's been a long day.
I understand. All right, great. Thank you for playing that for us. My speakers are not powerful enough for it. So, I mean, I think that highlights some context. It also makes me think about my dad, who was Mexican American. He grew up in California in San Jose, where there were student walkouts. And he said, when this was happening, his dad said, "We're not Chicanos, we're Mexican Americans." So it highlights that and he very much would have been in a similar situation educationally as these young folks that they were talking about, which just highlights that this is, there's some who are interested in participating in this, and it's a broad community that doesn't have like one identity here. But I was kind of surprised to hear him say that it wasn't him. So I'd love to hear from a couple folks, this thinking routine from Project Zero, any of these things. So what do you see? Were there images? What do you think about what you saw? What do you wonder, or maybe what does this help us understand about the excerpt we read? Does it fill in any gaps? Does it add to our understanding of that? And you can either chat, you could unmute yourself, you can do a range of things. But I'd love to hear from at least one or two folks. No, it's hard as it's Thursday evening.
An interesting thing that I feel like I heard was how this idea that there were a core group of students who organized and were sort of like spearheading this, but it awoke this desire for change that so many other people, so many other students had within them. And so it's sort of interesting to think about, like, I think we always are, when organizing, you're thinking about like, well, how many people are going to support this? And how do we know? And so it's interesting to think about how students like were leading this, but like they probably weren't sure that everybody was going to go out and join them until like it really manifested.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's a really good point, right? There's a small like cadre of students who are making the plans, but they actually did get a lot of people out there, for sure. And I think and they also had these protests, these walkouts earlier than planned. There was like a thing where one of the schools, the principal said they couldn't perform a play that they wanted to perform. And so that also posed some logistical challenges for them. Absolutely. And I wonder, to the power of the Raza newspaper, not that everyone's reading it, greetings from the Philippines, hello, the power of this to kind of spread the message and to kind of help shape Chicano identity. Thank you very much. Oops, I'm not gonna play that again. So takeaways, what connections do you see? And you can chat these before or say them aloud. What connections do you see between past and present? And what can we learn from this about kind of tools that young people have to make social change? And then this question, which is kind of at the core of what these young people are calling for, how should schools respond to changing demographics? This I wanted to highlight is included, I think, in all of the Raza newspapers. It's like the editorial list of editors, and this explains kind of what the newspaper does. It's in the kind of handout graphic organizer that we'll share with you as one of the things you might want to look at to help understand La Raza newspaper and this movement more broadly. But what are some of the things we might take away from this? Next one, not to mute. So I think they certainly have an answer to how should schools respond to changing demographics. They were calling for things like bilingual education, culturally relevant, maybe didn't say that term, maybe didn't exist at the time, education. They wanted racist teachers to be fired, and there are lots of testimonies about experiences of students and the particularly racist things that their teachers said to them about stereotypes about Mexican Americans. In La Raza, there was published a letter from a teacher where he basically says, you guys have it better than you've ever had it before, and includes like a litany of racial stereotypes. And then there's another teacher who responds saying, sorry about that guy. So they have an answer to that question. A lot of what they called for didn't come to fruition at that time. They were able to get a meeting with the school board. They even got the school board to come meet at one of the dilapidated schools in Boyle Heights. But there were kind of efforts by community members and parents to organize like an educational committee of their own, but they didn't get that immediate change that they wanted. I think some of the other takeaways of this, and thinking about the long context of Boyle Heights, is that identity is a source of pride. We see that in the signs that people are holding, and it's also a source of shared action. And it's the shared identity. What they deserve is kind of promoting that action. Also with Boyle Heights, and the documentary touched on this a little bit, it's a multiracial community with cross-cultural pollination, right? There are a lot of Chicano students who were influenced by the Watts Rebellions in 1965 and by their neighbors working in the African Americans, the Civil Rights Movement as well. And then there are kind of on a smaller scale, you see that in Boyle Heights, between a girl, Paula Crisostomo, who she was one of the main leaders of these walkouts. And she talks about how her mother organized with African-American women in the public housing that they all lived in for better conditions as well. And they learned from each other and worked together. And I see this as a rejection of how they're defined by Anglo, by teachers, and a rejection of the discriminatory policies that had shaped Boyle Heights. So I think it's very much connected to all those policies that were shaping this community for a long time. and develop a new identity that could, help provide insights for dismantling the structures of oppression that they experienced as well. So there are many takeaways. Those are just some of mine. If in a classroom, I might, after kind of talking about this, put these up, ask students to maybe pick 1 or 3 if I wanted them to write a lot, to talk about, what mostly to write an exit flip, perhaps to kind of check on their thinking, to kind of get a sense of what they thought about it as well. And trying to make connections between what we discussed, what they read, and they may have, they probably would have read more of the excerpts from Raza, to kind of help us understand identity and the actions taken in these walkouts. I want to thank you very much for being here. I see Valencia left a message, and it's really wonderful to be here with you all. And I wanted to open up if anyone has questions. This would be a good time to ask questions.
While we're asking questions, I just am throwing into the chat a survey. Please take the survey. Your feedback is always appreciated, and we always want to do better, and just would like to get a better understanding of what you have learned and maybe some other topics or ideas that you're interested in as well. So we are open for question and answer with Elisabeth. We have a couple of minutes, and also the survey is in the chat. You can either put your question in the comments again or speak it into existence.
And the handouts that we shared, make adaptations. I'd love to hear what if you use them, if you make changes to them, things like that. I see a question. Yes, there are other La Raza issues available digitized. There are a lot of them. And let's see if I can find the exact place. They're all, I think, at the UCLA has them housed online, and they're really high quality, which is one of the reasons in terms of like how they digitize them. So I can send a link that shows that gets you to the database of them. It's a great question. Let's see if I can find it. Other questions? Thank you.
Just a question out of curiosity. So like the students that were actively leading like the protests in Boyle Heights, where are they now? And are they folks that you think could want to be reached, would be like interested in speaking to students, or is that maybe a little too much?
Interested in what was the last part? I didn't quite hear.
In connecting with students today.
So there are a lot of interviews with people involved. So Paula Crisostomo, her name is in one of the handouts that were sent to you. If you Google her name, she's done a lot of interviews about this, about her organizing. Moctezuma Esparza, he is around, he became a Hollywood producer. He actually produced Selena, which I was like, oh my God, I love him. So yeah, there are, interviews with folks who are involved for sure. And I wonder, maybe, I don't know, Paula Crisostomo, like she's done interviews with like local like news sites that are kind of focused on, I think it was like the 50th anniversary of these walkouts. So I think there could be potential to reaching out to them and to talk about this. I don't know them though. What happened after this too is that 13 folks were arrested. They're like not the high school students. They were all over 18. And Moctezuma Esparza, this guy who you heard from in the documentary, he wrote for La Raza. He was arrested, and there was a major trial. They were all acquitted eventually, but that didn't happen. Let's see a question.
Elisabeth, we have a question from C. Aguilar. Have you ever watched the film Walkout? If so, do you feel it does a good job of explaining the walkouts to viewers? I have not. Now my interest has peaked, so I will definitely watch it. I'm not sure about you, Elisabeth.
I haven't watched it. I hadn't heard about it until Beer and I were talking, but Yeah, that's a great question. And it'd be interesting to, I don't know, potentially do an assignment like historicizing it, right? Kind of comparing. But I also would like to watch it. Okay, that's good. And they include the demands, and then what happens afterward. Yeah, I mean, and film can really highlight the like affective, the emotional experience, of how something like this comes to happen at a particular moment. I need to check that out. Other questions? Still trying to find the Raza database, so I can get that to you, but
We can also definitely add it to the links, because we will be sending a thank you email with links to the resources, a recording of the session, and also a copy of the slide deck if you're interested. So we will definitely include that into the welcome email as well. And, you know, reimagining migration is there for, you know, to answer any of your questions. You have Elisabeth's email, and the email that will be sent out, I was included in that email as well. You can also go to our website and check out the other resources that we have there regarding other civic action, but also other types of materials that you may be looking for to help with in your classroom. I did share the Project Zero thinking routines, which are very helpful as well. If you haven't used them before, I highly recommend them. And then our website as well. I think if we're good, if there are no more questions, we can probably let people go, give them the gift of time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much, Elisabeth, for this wonderful presentation.
thank you, Amir, and
yeah.
thanks to everybody.
I love it. Thank you. Oh, wonderful. That's great. Thank you, Megan.